Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam: The Sands of Time. It's action and adventure in ancient Egypt in this terrific teen time travel romance. Get your copy of E-Steam: The Sands of Time at your favorite online bookseller today. Yesterday I was watching videos by Englentine, also known as I Love Comics, and That Umbrella Guy, where they talked about Phil Boyle of Coliseum Comics in Central Florida calling out the bad business practices that the comic book industry has participated in that has led to him losing a lot of business. And I had read an article, I believe, on Bounding into Comics, which outlined Phil Boyle's plans for trying to fix the comic book industry. And as I read his outline, it sounded very similar to a lot of the things I wrote way back starting in my blog on Shawn James Black Freelance Writer on May 19th, 2011. Now I'm going to leave a link to that May 19th, 2011 blog, and I'm going to leave a link to the ebook that I made, which was compiled from all those blogs, called An Analysis of the Comic Book Industry's Business Issues. And in those series of blogs and in that ebook, I talked about a lot of the problems that are going on in the comic book industry right now, and I predicted back then we were going to have a crisis in the comic book industry if we did not deal with the problems that have been festering in the comic book industry ever since the collapse of the industry over 20 years ago. Because when it comes down to the comic book industry has been in trouble for over 20 years, and now the situation has gotten extremely dire. And it's gotten so dire that you have people like Phil Boyle who are finally starting to see what the problems are as related to the comic book industry. The same problems I saw as far back as 2011. And I was trying to explain to people back then that these problems were going to get worse, but not that many people listened to me back then. And I remember when I released the original An Analysis of the Comic Book Industry's Business Issues, I had a lot of these comic book fans out here. They were giving me 1-star reviews on Amazon.com, and then they were saying that I didn't know what I was talking about. But we fast forward 8 years later, and we see that everything that I had written in those blogs has now come to pass. And now we have people like Phil Boyle confirming what I was saying in that blog and that ebook over 8 years ago. Because 8 years ago, I could see the problems going on in the comic book industry because I looked at the business model from the perspective of a trade publisher. And from the perspective of a trade publisher, I saw real serious issues with the business model, because the business model of distribution through Diamond is not helping anyone, because with these comics being non-returnable, we're not getting a good gauge of what is selling, because it's all about selling to the stores and not selling to the customer. And the books are primarily distributed just to comic stores and not to other retailers, because most retailers demand returnability for any product. So that's one of the core problems with the comic book industry. The other issue with the comic book industry that Marvel and DC refuse to deal with is the problem of median age. Now, the median age of a comic book reader back in 2011 was 35 years old. And the median age of a comic book reader today is 45 years old. And what most people don't understand about a median age of 45 is that in other companies like the Kraft Corporation or these other corporations out here, when a product has a median age of 45, that's when a company says it's time to discontinue that product. And the reason why they want to discontinue that product is because they know that the base of customers that bought that product have one foot on a banana peel and the other foot going in the graveyard. So they know that there are no more customers who will be able to buy this product once this group of customers who grew up with it die out. And an example of that is with Nabisco. Now, Nabisco had some products called Crown Pilot crackers and Royal Lunch milk crackers. And those products stayed on the shelf throughout the 1920s, I believe, and even before the 1890s, all the way up until about 2008 or 2009. And the reason why Nabisco stopped making Crown Pilot crackers and Royal Lunch milk crackers is because the median age of the customer for a Crown Pilot cracker or a Royal Lunch milk cracker was about 60 years old. So there was no more reason for Nabisco to continue manufacturing Crown Pilot crackers or Royal Lunch milk crackers because there were no customers to buy this product in the future, and the current group of customers, the audience had shrunk so much that there was no reason for them to have any other place to take the market for that product. The people who knew that product, many of them were already dead, and the rest of them who were around were not large enough to sustain a production run of that product. So this is where the comic book industry is right now. When you have a median age, again, of 45, you have one foot in a grave and another on a banana peel as it relates to business, because this is why Oldsmobile is no longer in service. This is why they no longer make Pontiac cars. And the main reason, again, is because the people who knew Cutlass Supremes and Trans Ams, most of these people are in their 60s and in their 70s, and Pontiac and Oldsmobile had no place to go. So they had no place to market to customers, so those brands wound up being phased out by General Motors. And when you look at the American comic book, the problem is that we have a median age of 45 and no way of trying to lower that median age, because back in 1987, when I was 13 years old, the median age of a comic book reader was 13 years old. And right now, when we look at manga, the median age of a reader of manga is 13 years old. So with manga, the market has no place to go but up. But when it comes down to the American comic book, the market is pretty much, it's on its way out. And the sad part is nobody in the comic book industry has a plan to try to reach all of those new, younger possible readers out there who have been watching all of these Marvel Studios movies. And what's really even sadder than that is that the whole industry, both Marvel Comics, DC Comics, and all these other brands, have missed out on one of the greatest windows of opportunity to reach an entire brand new generation of readers. Because a lot of comic shops, those movies could have been a golden opportunity to reach all of those new readers. Unfortunately, Marvel did not take characters like Iron Man, who was featured in a hit movie, or the Avengers, and put them in titles that allow the characters to really shine and allow readers to really find out who these characters were. No, instead, they put Riri Williams in an Iron Man comic, just as these MCU movies were going on. They put Sam Wilson in a Captain America costume, and they put Jane Foster in a Thor costume, and that prevented the Marvel's publishing division from reaching an entire generation of new readers. Now, also in my first blog, I also talked about pricing, and pricing is another issue that I've heard Umbrella Guy talk about in his videos, and I've heard other comic YouTubers talk about. And Marvel's solution is to try to raise prices in the hopes of making the numbers look better. Now, back in 2011, I warned how the whole comic book industry was in trouble because the prices have hit the market threshold. Now, this was back in 2011 when comic book prices were $2.99 and $3.99, and today you have comic book companies now trying to sell books for $4.99, $5.99, and even $9.99, and the books just aren't moving. What many of these people in the industry don't understand is that comic book prices are at the market threshold, and the market threshold is something that Adam Smith talked about in The Wealth of Nations when he talked about real and nominal price. This is a basic economic concept, and what price is what the customer is willing to pay. And right now, comics prices, they have hit the market threshold. A 32-page comic book right now it's at the threshold at $2.99 and $3.99 in 2011, and then you have people in the industry still trying to raise the price, not understanding that comic books have to compete with other forms of media. And I talked about this in blogs as well. Comic books today are not like they were in the 80s, where they just had to deal with television, movies, and home video. No, today comic books have to compete with ebooks, paperbacks, apps, games. They have to also compete with streaming services like Netflix and Hulu and a couple of other ones out there. But they have a lot of stiff competition for eyeballs. And this is something the comic book industry doesn't understand, because they're sitting there thinking that they can compete with these comics that feature these really terrible stories. But when you're in a competitive marketplace and you have a product that is now priced higher than most ebooks, which are usually priced at $3.99 for a full novel, or like in my case of my ISIS series, you can get the same type of story as a comic for $3.99. You have competition out here that is cheaper and better and offers a higher entertainment value per dollar. And this is something, again, many in the industry don't understand about comics. They're sitting there thinking that this marketplace is like it was before, but comics face really stiff competition. And what's really exacerbates the problem is that we have all of these reboots going on, and what the reboots do is they wind up killing most of the momentum. I've talked about this in videos, and I also talked about this in an analysis of the comic book industry's business issues. And these reboots, what they do is they kill the momentum, because when you have a reboot, what happens is all the stuff in the comics that people bought before is no longer valid. So all the old readers no longer have an incentive to go out here and buy the new books. So all those back issue sales that comic shops used to benefit from, they can no longer get them. And Phil talked about this because he's dealing with all of these books that, like the New 52 books, like the old Marvel Universe books, and like the books that are Marvel now, all those books have no value anymore because the customer has no incentive to pick up those books as back issues. Back when I was a kid, there was only one Marvel Universe and one DC Universe, so you could go out and go pick up those back issues to find out the first appearance of a character, and it would still be valid. Or you could go back to find out about an old story arc that was referenced in a recent issue. So when you have a solid continuity, the reader who's holding the book now can either move back in the story or move forward in the story. But when you have a reboot, what happens is the reader has no incentive to go back into the old issues. And if the story is bad that they're holding in their hands right now, they have no interest in moving forward with your story either. And this is something that your editors at Marvel and DC still don't understand 8 years later, and they didn't even understand it back in 2001, and when the reboot for Heroes Return wound up falling completely apart under Joe Quesada's leadership. Because with the 2001 Heroes Reborn, the runs had ended for Kurt Busiek and George Perez on Avengers. Kurt Busiek had left Iron Man. Mark Waid had left Captain America, and I think the writer had left Fantastic Four. And those books were put into secondary teams, and when the books hit secondary teams, that's when several books like Iron Man and Captain America fell off almost immediately, and then Avengers really collapsed with Disassembled. And that's what led to the second reboot, which gave us New Avengers with Luke Cage and Spider-Woman and Spider-Man, but then that fell off, and then that's where we started to see this slow decline, because with each reboot, you had readers walking away from the comics because everything that happened before had no value, and things only got worse because what happened was when you have these reboots constantly happening, the reader has no jumping on point to get on, and they have no incentive to stay on because they don't know what's going to be canon in the universe. And I wrote about that again in my blogs, and I also wrote about it 8 years ago in an analysis of the comic book industry's business issues. So I've wrote about this 8 years ago, and now we're starting to see that a lot of the things I wrote about back then are now sadly coming to pass. And a lot of people in the comic book industry who were criticizing me then and saying that I didn't know I was talking about on boards like Comic Book Resources and on other numerous websites like the ones people who on Amazon gave me the 1-star reviews. Now they're starting to understand what I said in my blog years ago when I said the comic book industry is not too big to fail. Because when you have at that time in 2011, top-selling titles which were selling 50 to 70,000 copies a month in 2011, and people back then were finding cheaper forms of entertainment, the comic book industry is on the road to extinction. And that's where we're headed right now, because in a country of over 300 million people like the United States, most kids don't know what American comic books are, and most under 12 just don't care. And this is something many people in the industry just don't understand about the state of the industry right now, because we were in trouble in 2011, and now today we are in crisis mode, because this is where we see the industry about to be on the brink of collapsing. And everybody I've seen these days has been saying the same thing. I mean, Diversity in Comics said the same thing a couple of weeks ago. He said the industry is going to collapse. But I predicted this collapse way back in 2011 because, again, the comic book industry has no place to go anymore because you have a market that is no longer sustainable. There aren't enough readers to sustain the few remaining comic shops, and there aren't enough readers to actually meet Diamond Distributors' minimum order at this point. So I'm looking at the industry, and over the next 2-3 years, again, I see that collapse coming because at this state, the business model right now is just not sustainable. Because we look at the readers leaving the comics, we look at the catalogs at places like Marvel and DC Comics, and you have too many titles chasing too few readers, and you have a distribution system that does not really allow retailers an opportunity to return bad product for credit, and that not being able to return product for credit, again, is hindering not only the comic shop, but it's hindering the comic book industry from being able to reach marketplaces like retailers in grocery stores, supermarkets, bodegas, drugstores, and places like Walmart and Target. Now, yes, they do distribute these 100-page comics in Walmart and Target, but that's just not enough at this point to really get the industry going. When I look at the industry right now, the product that's being produced right now is some of the worst I have ever seen. The quality is just at its worst. And again, the only thing I believe that's going to save the industry is a collapse, because once we have the industry collapse, then people can really wake up and see the sad state of affairs that things are, and that from there, then you can rebuild the comic book industry into something that can really reach those younger people who went out here to see all those Marvel Studios movies and saw movies like Aquaman. But again, what's really sad is that this industry, again, has had these problems way back for the last 20 years. And again, I wrote about this back in 2011. And I believe if the industry had done something in 2011, maybe we could have saved the comic book industry from this coming collapse. But I believe at this point, there's not much anybody can do at this point, because the situation is just so dire at this point that there's not anything anybody can do to rebuild the modern American comic book industry, especially when you have grossly unqualified people like Dan Dido working at DC, Sana Amanat working at Marvel, Jordan White working at Marvel, and many others who have no publishing experience, no understanding of the publishing industry, no understanding of the publishing marketplace and no understanding of how trade publishing works. Because if Marvel or DC had a seasoned, trained publishing pro like myself who understood how the publishing industry worked, and they were working at Marvel or DC in 2011, I believe that the industry would be in a lot better shape. I believe that the industry would be a lot more competitive, and there would be an effort to try to reach all of those readers who wound up watching all of those movies but did not ever come into a comic shop. That was the missed opportunity that could have saved the comic book industry. Unfortunately, back in 2011, we just did not have the leadership in place at these comic publishers who understood the problems that were going on or a plan to really reach those readers. And that's why the industry is in the dire situation it is right now. And this is why many of these independent comics are coming up, because they're out. These guys understand the marketplace, they understand the customer, and they understand what the readers really want. So when I look at the industry right now, the future of comics is going to be independent, and it's going to be creator-owned independent characters, and I believe that those books are going to be funded either through Indiegogo or your Kickstarter, and most of those books, after they're funded through Indiegogo and Kickstarter, they're going to find their audience either through print on demand for paper copies, or they're going to find their audience through e-readers like the Kindle or the Nook or the iPad. And that's going to be the future of the comic book industry. But for the current state of the print comic book industry, it's right now in the death throes. And again, this is something I talked about far back as 2011. And sadly, back in 2011, people didn't hear me then. And sadly, I guess many of them out there are wishing that they had heard me now. Now, if you want to read those blogs that I talked about, I will leave a link to them in the description box. And if you want to read the whole ebook, an analysis of the comic book industry's business issues, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, Isis, Imitation of Life. The Goddess Next Door helps a young black girl overcome racism during the era of Jim Crow in this Golden Age Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Imitation of Life in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.